So I was just watching a clip of TYT, and the TYT panel was talking about you know corruption done by a Republican senator. And ironically, they were talking about the Capitol Grill, which is in Massachusetts. And Capitol Grill is notoriously known in Massachusetts for being the place for politicians and those with wealth to come in and basically plot and talk and do shady deals. It's been known for decades upon decades upon decades. It is completely and utterly exclusive. You cannot go there. You have to be in high six figures even to consider going to this place. And not only that, but you have to actually have some sort of influence and connection in order to get into that place. Politicians go there constantly. That's their go-to place to do these dealings. So it was interesting to hear that the senator, I forget the guy's name, that he was there talking with the telecommunication companies like AT&T and Verizon, all and making deals. And that was not really that's not really a shocker, considering that is what the Capitol Grill which is one of those suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts. It's I forget the name of the city or the town that it's part of, but it's Boston has Massachusetts and Boston. It's kind of funny because like Brookline, Cambridge, Newton, Needham, Dorchester, High Park, and all sorts of other places are actually considered part of Boston, but they are towns and cities of their own. So like Harvard is in Cambridge, and that's considered part of Boston, the greater Boston area. So, anyways, this Capitol Grill is in one of those towns. So, anyways, I'm digressing here, but I wanted to do this video because, interesting enough, TYT, the last comment that one of the panel had made was that there's this always constant talk by the media, even media, left media, social media, uses this trope, and the politicians use this trope as well. We've all heard it. In the richest country in the world. Well, he also insinuated, with his last comment. I think it was the guy. Anyways, but he also insinuated, like, when we're talking about the richest country in the world, who's actually what are we talking about when we're talking about richest country? And he's right, because it's not the richest country in the world. Okay, it's the richest people in the world, meaning a very tiny fraction, so minuscule it is ridiculous. So you're talking about less than what you can count on one hand, holding more, holding like 60 or 65% of the of the wealth, and wealth meaning the money and as well as lands and resources, including communal resources. So whereas the rest of the country, uh, you have like less than a quarter of the country that holds country's population, which holds uh, the other uh, the other 40% of the wealth, or even less. Actually, no, probably about 30% of the country's uh, monetary wealth. Uh, Whereas you have 70% or better that, and there's a lot of polls and stats and so on and so forth that indicate that 75 to 80, if not higher, uh, can't afford uh, can't afford to have a cost that's $400 and an emergency cost that's $400, and I know for that for a fact that's true with me, and I know dozens upon dozens upon dozens of people that's the same thing. Uh, so uh, yeah, so when we're talking about we're talking about less than a quarter% of the country's population that holds this quote unquote wealth, and the ones that overwhelmingly control the wealth. That means the economically resource, food, and so when I talk about resources, I'm talking about water and and electricity and lands. So you have and those are the ones, and those are the ones, and they include the politicians. A vast majority of the politicians, from state to federal. So, or if they're not politicians, they're officials, and if they're not officials, they're in the private sector, and these people make up less than a percent of the population, far less than a percent. So, so when we're talking about richest country in the world, you're talking about the them, not the general public. The general public is finding costs going up constantly, whether it's to buy food, whether it's to buy to have electricity or water, or their taxes, and so and there's less and more restrictions on uh, on things like going to what should be communal lands to use, like the national parks and so on and so forth. Uh, you have to often pay to go into those places, or if you go in there, there's so many goddamn restrictions. It's silly and stupid. I mean, there we do need regulations, such as lighting, having campfires, or where you throw your trash and so on and so forth, because you don't want to, or cutting down trees and so on and so forth, and or encroaching on public lands to build private structures. Uh, that those sort of, but I'm talking about other. I'm talking about regulations that are basically there to extort money. And they call it for cost. When in fact that all the taxes that we pay every time we buy something, and paychecks that we get, and in the taxes that we pay, they're being literally these politicians and these private interests are basically putting their hand in the cookie jar and taking those taxes uh, and and privatizing it and making their own. So we're literally being robbed by these people, and it's not just the money, because you have to understand you're working your ass off for this. You're sacrificing your time with your family and friends. You're this is this is a full spectrum robbery, and the fact that we're not up in arms, the fact that all this corruption, when they call it corruption, but I don't call it corruption. I call it crimes. I call it treason. And for them to do this, and for us to be so blasé about it, and so incremental about it, I find that baffling. When we should be dragging them out of their homes and putting them in chains and sending them to jail. Um, we should be taking back everything uh, and and uh, and socializing the cost back into our coffers, and using that for our infrastructure, for our education, our health system, uh, for uh, hiring hiring uh, actual citizens who are going to serve and protect, actual citizens who are going to represent. And you know, the fact that we have a education secretary who has, I think, one report says she has 12 gigantic yachts. That's just ridiculous. And that's because she committed crimes willy nilly in her home state, and basically dipped her hand into the coffers of uh, of of Michigan uh, and uh, and the federal government to be able to get where she is. Her whole family, including her brother Eric Prince. They've literally been stealing. Uh, but that's the case with the Walton family. That's the case with Bob Kraft. That's the case with Steve Mnuchin. That's the case with uh, every big name out there. The Koch brothers, um, the Mercers. It's the case with all of them. And the thing is there's been a direct connection over history, where there were actual people that were not legitimate. They were, like Bugsy Siegel, and other big mafia bosses, and how they actually went from going from crime to being labeled criminal organizations to legitimacy. So there is more than anecdotal evidence of this, and so what we have is that going on. So, anyways, I massively digressed and spent more time than I was going to, but basically, the that whole the richest country is a complete lie, because the country is a collection of all U.S. citizens, and the plain fact of the matter is, vast majority of the U.S. citizens don't have the actual monetary or resource control, because it's all being bled and robbed, and it's all done under legitimacy. All right, thanks.